My whole world has always been my only son, Adrian. When he won $25 million in the lottery, I thought fate had finally shown us kindness. I cooked him a special celebratory meal, something warm and comforting, something only a mother makes. But 30 minutes after dinner, he collapsed on the floor, struggling to breathe. As I rushed to call an ambulance, his wife Petra didn't scream, she smirked. Then she said the cruelest words a mother could ever hear, that the money was hers now, and I could rot in jail. The world believed her. They said I poisoned my own child. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I went quiet because I already knew something she didn't. There are cameras in my home, and they see everything, so 24 hours later, when Petra received the video I sent her, she didn't just panic, she broke. And the truth finally spoke louder than her lies. My name is Lorraine Whitfield, and I am 61 years old, and today my son came home a millionaire. Adrian walked into my modest kitchen with a stunned expression on his face, his lottery ticket clutched tightly in his hand like it might disappear if he blinked. He told me the news softly, almost reverently, and then he hugged me the way he hadn't done since he was a boy. I cried, not because of the money, but because life had finally given him a blessing instead of another wound. Petra arrived later, acting sweet and supportive, but I caught the glitter of possession in her eyes. Still, I decided to believe the best. My heart was full, my mind peaceful, and my only thought was to cook my son a meal that tasted like love and home. I didn't know that by nightfall, my life would be branded with a nightmare I could never have imagined. Adrian didn't want a lavish party or crowds. He just wanted dinner at home with the two women who had been closest to him in recent years. I agreed immediately, happy that success hadn't changed his heart. Petra pretended to approve, but I sensed her disappointment at not being able to flaunt the win. Still, she smiled and offered to set the table while I began cooking. We spoke about what Adrian planned to do with the money: invest, travel, clear debts, normal dreams. I tried to hide my worry about how this much money can change people, but I brushed it aside. Tonight was about joy, about seeing my son relaxed for the first time in years. I seasoned the food with care, wanting every bite to remind him he was still safe, still loved, still mine. While Adrian showered, Petra lingered in the kitchen, watching me with an intensity that made my skin tight. She asked questions: who owned the house, whether Adrian had a will, whether the ticket had been claimed in his name alone. Her tone was wrapped in politeness, but the core of it was hunger. I answered cautiously, wondering when love had become competition. She wrapped her arms around herself as though cold and murmured about securing the future. I nodded, but my instincts whispered that something wasn't right. Still, I didn't confront her. I wanted harmony for Adrian. So I lowered the heat on the stove, folded napkins, and told myself I was imagining the sharpness in her eyes. I didn't yet understand the lengths greed can stretch without breaking. Cooking has always been my way of loving. I made Adrian's childhood favorite, the dish he begged for on every birthday, the one he said tasted like comfort and safety. As the scent filled the house, his face lit up with nostalgia. We sat down together, plates warm, hearts lighter than they had been in years. The conversation included laughter, teasing, and even Petra joined in, seeming softer than before. I relaxed a little. Maybe I had misjudged her. Maybe fear had made me unfair. I watched Adrian eat happily, grateful tears burning behind my eyes. For one golden moment, I allowed myself to believe life might finally be kind, but under the laughter lay a quiet tension. Petra's gaze rarely left Adrian's plate. Every time he lifted a fork, her eyes followed it as though counting each bite. Her smile was too fixed, too sharp. I tried to ignore it, focusing on Adrian's stories about how he wanted to help others, how money would not change him. His gentle heart made me proud and afraid. Rich people grow targets on their backs, and I feared my son was already wearing one. Still, I kept serving, kept smiling, as the unease crept over the room like a slow fog. It happened so suddenly that my mind refused to accept it. One moment Adrian was laughing, and the next his face drained of color. He clutched his stomach, gasped for breath, and then crashed to the floor. My heart stopped. I ran to him, my hands shaking, my voice screaming his name as I fumbled for the phone to call an ambulance. His body convulsed while I tried to steady him, whispering prayers into the chaos. I expected Petra to help, to panic, to do anything. But what she did instead will haunt me forever. Petra didn't scream or cry. She stepped back, folded her arms, and watched. Then, as sirens approached, she smiled, a cold, satisfied smile, and told me not to bother pretending. She said the money was hers now, and that I could rot in jail for poisoning my own son. Her voice dripped venom, and the words sliced through me. When the paramedics arrived, she clutched her chest and wailed that I had poisoned the food. Within minutes, I was no longer a mother trying to save her child. I was a suspect. And the nightmare truly began. She stood frozen on the front lawn as the flashing red lights washed over the house, her heart thundering louder than the sirens. Paramedics worked on her son inside the ambulance while officers gathered around her, notebooks open, eyes sharp with suspicion. Petra played the part of the devastated wife flawlessly, sobbing into a blanket while whispering poison into willing ears. Every time she said she poisoned him, the words wrapped tighter around the mother's throat. One officer asked her to sit down, but his tone wasn't kind, it was controlling, like she was already guilty. She tried to explain that she only cooked dinner, that she loved her son more than life itself, but grief and fear twisted her voice into something small and desperate. And the more helpless she sounded, the more convinced they became. By the time the ambulance pulled away, she realized she was no longer just a mother fighting for her child, she was a suspect fighting for her freedom. At the hospital, the focus wasn't on reviving her son, at least not for Petra. Instead, conversations shifted toward legal rights, signatures, and financial control. Petra insisted she needed immediate access to accounts for medical emergencies, spinning a tale of being trapped with a controlling, unstable mother-in-law. Staff exchanged troubled looks, not about the money, but about the poison story. It spread through the building like smoke. The mother stood alone in the hallway, ignored, while Petra clutched paperwork with trembling theatrics. She noticed every conveniently timed tear, every dramatic gasp. It hit her then, the money hadn't created this ugliness. It had only exposed what was already living beneath Petra's skin. And as her son lay unconscious, the woman who promised to love him was already addressing the world as if he were gone. The interrogation room smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. A metal table separated her from two detectives who spoke in calm, measured voices that carried sharp blades. They asked what she cooked, how she seasoned it, whether she had argued with her son or resented Petra's presence. Every ordinary memory turned suspicious in their hands. She tried to describe laughter at dinner, how her son had hugged her only hours before collapse. But their expressions remained unchanged, pens scratching across notepads like tiny hammers nailing down guilt. She felt stripped bare, not just as a suspect, but as a mother whose love was now presented as a weapon. They asked if she'd ever felt replaced. They asked if she had financial troubles. They asked questions that painted a monster, and then waited for her to step into its shadow. She left that room feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. When she was finally allowed to see her son, he lay pale and still beneath a maze of wires and monitors, his chest rising only because machines commanded it to. The rhythmic beeping felt like a countdown she couldn't control. She wanted to hold his hand, but a nurse hovered nearby as though guarding him from her. The implication cut deeper than any knife. She whispered prayers instead, prayers that slipped between memories of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and birthdays filled with cheap cake but real love. She blamed herself for not protecting him, for trusting the wrong person, for being too gentle in a world that rewards cruelty. And still, she waited for one sign of life, a twitch, a breath, a miracle, anything to prove he hadn't already slipped beyond her reach. News travels fast when money is involved, faster still when scandal fuels it. By morning, neighbors avoided her eyes, phones buzzed nonstop, and reporters camped outside like hyenas waiting for a carcass to drop. Headlines labeled her a jealous, unstable mother who poisoned her rich son. Even distant relatives called to ask whether it was true, not because they cared, but because gossip is delicious when sprinkled with tragedy. She stopped answering the phone. The world had decided her guilt long before any evidence existed. Meanwhile, Petra posed outside the hospital, wrapped in a widow's shawl of false grief, allowing cameras to capture her trembling chin. Watching it all, the mother finally understood this wasn't chaos. This was strategy. Petra wasted no time. Lawyers were contacted, accounts were frozen, signatures demanded. She spoke confidently about protecting assets, as though her husband were already gone. Any attempt the mother made to question her was met with icy dismissal or crocodile tears. She realized she was being boxed into a corner where every move would look like guilt. Police kept calling, detectives kept circling, and the story grew larger than the truth. She felt herself disappearing into the role they had written for her, the bitter, controlling mother who couldn't let go. But beneath that fear, something hardened. She knew she couldn't scream her way out of this. She would have to think, so she went quiet, not out of defeat, but out of clarity. Speaking had only armed her enemies. Silence, however, allowed her to watch, to notice, to remember the small details others missed. She replayed the night in her mind again and again until patterns emerged, Petra's watchful eyes, the supplements her son took daily, the way Petra hovered around his belongings before dinner. Silence became her armor, her strategy, her first step toward survival. Because deep inside, one truth burned brighter than every lie. She had not poisoned her son, and if she didn't, then someone else did. And that meant the real story hadn't even begun yet. She returned to her silent house with a heart full of fear and a mind sharpened by shock. Everyone believed she had poisoned her son, but she knew the truth lived somewhere inside these walls. Closing the curtains, she walked room to room until she reached the small security console hidden in a cupboard. Years ago, after a break-in, she had installed discreet cameras throughout the house and then quietly forgotten about them. Now they were her last lifeline. With trembling hands, she scrolled through recordings of the previous day, watching ordinary moments of cooking, laughter, and footsteps passing through hallways. Then she saw Petra enter the kitchen alone while her son was showering, moving with deliberation rather than panic. The mother leaned closer to the screen, dread building like a storm. Whatever happened here, the cameras had seen it, and suddenly she no longer felt powerless. She felt dangerous. Her breath caught when the footage revealed Petra carefully opening the cupboard where her son kept his daily supplements, bottles meant to protect his health. Petra removed one, glanced over her shoulder, and poured something unseen into the capsules with the calm of someone folding laundry. There was no hesitation, no remorse. Afterward, she placed the bottle back exactly as it had been, wiped the counter, and practiced a devastated expression in the darkened oven glass. The mother's hands shook violently as she watched it. This wasn't panic. This wasn't an accident. This was intention, and it wasn't tied to love, but to money. She paused the screen and stared at Petra's frozen face, realizing that greed had turned a living, breathing human being into a silent predator. The meal had never been the weapon. The truth was hiding inside a bottle. She knew she couldn't walk into a police station alone with footage like this. Not when everyone had already painted her as the villain in this story. So she contacted a discreet private investigator recommended by a distant acquaintance, a calm, observant man named Nolan Price. He arrived without judgment, listened without interruption, and studied the footage with professional detachment instead of emotional shock. Where others saw drama, he saw evidence, timestamps, angles, continuity. He copied the recordings to secure drives and reassured her that truth had a way of resurfacing, even through the loudest lies. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt the faint outline of hope. She wasn't imagining things. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't guilty. She was a mother who had unknowingly invited a snake into her home, and now, finally, she wasn't facing it alone. While Nolan reviewed the footage, he pushed for an independent medical review. That was when quiet confirmations began to surface. The hospital's toxicology reports hinted at substances consistent with tampered medication, not poisoned food. The mother didn't celebrate. She simply sat very still and let the truth settle like dust. Every fact that cleared her name also deepened the horror of what had been done to her son. Meanwhile, Petra continued to perform for the world, trembling hands, tragic eyes, soft statements about safety and control. But science had no interest in sympathy. It simply spoke, softly and coldly, pointing its finger closer and closer toward the real culprit. All the mother had to do now was hold her silence and wait. Petra did everything she could to isolate him, restricting visitors, signing documents, insisting she alone should handle medical discussions. Nurses began to follow her instructions out of pity for the grieving wife, leaving the mother on the outside looking in. Each time she was denied access, the wound inside her deepened. But instead of begging, she observed. She noted names, times, expressions. She saw the way Petra flinched whenever hospital staff mentioned toxicology. Fear had begun to gnaw at the edges of Petra's performance. Her once controlled expression now cracked with anxiety. And the mother realized something crucial. Petra wasn't worried about losing her husband. She was worried about losing control. She and Nolan spent hours organizing every scrap of evidence. Camera footage, screenshots, timestamps, and medical notations, stacking truths like bricks to build an unbreakable case. She didn't rage. She didn't cry. She simply worked with quiet determination, fueled by love rather than vengeance. Every lie Petra had told was now a thread being pulled loose from the tapestry she had woven. And the mother found unexpected strength in this role, not victim, not suspect, but architect of truth. Soon the story would shift. Soon the world that judged her would see what she had endured. Her silence had not been a weakness, it was a strategy. When everything was ready, the mother scheduled a simple video file to be sent directly to Petra, one that contained the full footage from the kitchen. No threats, no dramatic words, just the truth delivered like a mirror. She imagined the exact moment Petra would open it, expecting gossip or leverage, only to watch her own betrayal unfold frame by frame. The timing was deliberate, 24 hours after the collapse, when sympathy for Petra was at its highest. The mother didn't plan to confront or argue. She simply wanted the truth to echo inside Petra's mind until fear did what justice had not yet done. And as she pressed send, she felt something she hadn't felt since this nightmare began. Power. Petra was sitting comfortably in the hospital lounge, wrapped in false grief, when the notification appeared on her phone. At first she frowned, confused by the anonymous sender, then curiosity won. She pressed play. The video opened to the familiar image of the kitchen, calm and ordinary. She leaned closer, expecting gossip or some attempt at emotional manipulation. But then she saw herself enter the frame, moving with calculated intent, opening the cupboard and pouring an unknown substance into the supplement bottle. The color drained from her face. Her breathing became shallow. She glanced around the room as if the walls might be watching. Every practiced tear, every lie she had fed the world, now stood exposed in unforgiving clarity. And for the first time since this began, it wasn't the mother who felt fear. It was her. She watched Petra's mask crumble from across the room. The dramatic widow persona dissolved, replaced by frantic eyes and trembling fingers desperately trying to delete the video, as if erasing the file could erase the truth. But the truth had already taken root. Petra began pacing, whispering urgently into her phone, her voice stripped of sorrow and dripping with panic. Nurses noticed. Visitors noticed. The mother simply sat still, her silence louder than any accusation. Every word Petra had spoken, every sob, every public plea for sympathy, shattered in that single moment. Lies are powerful until the truth finds a screen, and now the world would finally see what she had always known. While Petra spiraled, Nolan ensured the footage didn't vanish into digital dust. Copies had already been transmitted to multiple secure locations, including the authorities, time-stamped files, medical reports, all synchronized into a single, undeniable narrative. There would be no claims of editing, no convenient excuses. The mother didn't seek revenge through chaos, she sought justice through order. Nolan's calm professionalism served as a shield against corruption or manipulation. When the detectives received the files, the tone of their voices shifted from skepticism to tension. The narrative they had confidently believed now stood on cracking ice. And for the first time, the mother no longer felt alone in the world's courtroom. Two detectives arrived at the hospital with a quiet gravity that changed the air in the corridor. They approached Petra, who was mid-performance with a reporter, and asked her to step aside. Cameras caught her practiced sorrow dissolving into shock. In a private room, they played the footage for her, the same clip she'd already watched, only now it was evidence, not a warning. They asked simple questions. Why was she tampering with the bottle? Why lie about the meal? Why accuse the mother? Petra's excuses tripped over each other, weak and unbelievable. Her confidence wilted under the sterile lighting. Meanwhile, the mother waited outside, hands folded, heart steady. Justice had finally taken its first real breath. As if fate itself had been waiting for the mask to fall, her son finally stirred from unconsciousness. The machines beeped faster, nurses rushed in, and he opened his eyes to a world forever changed. When he was strong enough to listen, the truth was explained gently: the video, the toxicology, the betrayal lurking beneath his own roof. Pain etched itself into his face, not just from poison but from heartbreak. He reached for his mother's hand, and in that silent gesture, years of trust were restored. She didn't say, "I told you so." She simply held him, grateful that love had survived where greed had tried to kill it. Petra's carefully curated image collapsed publicly. News outlets that once praised her tragic bravery now replayed the footage endlessly, voices sharpened with condemnation. Friends distanced themselves. Lawyers withdrew. Strangers online tore through her lies without mercy. She wasn't the grieving wife anymore, she was the woman who poisoned for profit. Every step she took was now shadowed by flashing cameras and pointed questions. She tried to blame stress, confusion, even the mother, but the world had already seen too much. Truth, once revealed, refuses to return to silence. If this story has kept you on the edge so far, make sure to like and subscribe, because what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. Through it all, the mother chose dignity over spectacle. She didn't shout or celebrate. She didn't humiliate or insult. She visited her recovering son, cooperated with investigators, and allowed the truth to breathe on its own. Her silence, once used against her, now became a symbol of strength. Those who had doubted her struggled to meet her eyes. Detectives spoke to her with respect instead of suspicion. And as the chaos swirled around Petra, the mother finally felt a deep, steady calm. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was happening piece by fragile piece. The day Petra was arrested, the world suddenly felt quieter. Officers arrived without spectacle or drama, just calm certainty. She tried to perform again, crying out, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, but the handcuffs didn't care about tears. Facts had replaced feelings. The mother stood at a distance, watching the woman who had poisoned her son for money finally face consequences. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, only relief. For so long, she had been treated as the villain, whispered about, judged, condemned. Now the truth walked on solid ground. As Petra was led away, the cameras that once attacked the mother now followed the real criminal. Justice had taken its time, but it had arrived with unshakable authority. Healing didn't happen instantly. Her son carried not only physical weakness but emotional scars deeper than any wound. They sat together quietly in the hospital room, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing side by side, two souls stitched to one another by pain and love. He apologized over and over for not seeing what had been happening inside his own home. She never blamed him. Instead, she focused on what mattered, that he was alive, breathing, and finally safe. They relearned how to laugh, how to trust, how to sit in the same space without fear. Their bond didn't return to what it once was. It became stronger, tempered by fire and truth. The day her name was officially cleared, she held the signed documents in trembling hands and let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding for weeks. No more suspicion. No more headlines twisting her into a monster. She walked out of the courthouse not as an accused poisoner, but as a mother who survived injustice without letting hatred consume her. People who once avoided her now approached with soft apologies. Some meant it, some didn't. She accepted them all with grace because bitterness was another kind of prison, and she had spent enough time behind invisible bars. Together with honest advisors, financial safeguards were placed around her son's lottery winnings. Protections meant not just to preserve wealth, but to shield him from predators hiding behind charm. Decisions were made slowly, thoughtfully, without excitement or illusion. Money no longer represented dreams. It represented danger handled wisely. She encouraged him to live simply, to remember who he was before numbers changed everything. And he listened, really listened, because now he understood how thin the line is between fortune and tragedy. The wealth that once drew a viper into their lives would now be used with caution and conscience. Life gradually softened. Hospital visits turned into slow walks outside. Meals were lighter now, conversations calmer. She didn't hover over him, but he rarely drifted far. He started therapy, learning to understand betrayal without letting it harden him. She learned, too, about boundaries, about strength, about the voice she never again planned to silence. Their home changed from a battlefield of suspicion back into a shelter. And though shadows still lingered in certain corners of memory, light had finally returned through the windows. Sometimes she sat alone at the kitchen table, remembering the night everything shattered. She didn't replay the cruelty, she replayed the strength she never knew she possessed. Silence had kept her safe. Evidence had spoken louder than emotion. Truth had not needed drama, only patience. She realized that love isn't loud and neither is justice. Both arrive quietly and stay permanently. Betrayal will always exist in the world, but so will courage. In the end, she didn't want revenge stories or praise. She only wanted peace, and she found it not in courts or headlines, but in the warm, steady heartbeat of her recovering son. Greed had roared like a monster, tearing through their lives, but truth stood taller. And when truth finally rose, greed shrank to nothing more than a whisper in history. Her journey wasn't about winning. It was about surviving with dignity, and she did.